On the morning of Thanksgiving at the historic Sterling family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, the savory aroma of roasting turkey and the sweet scent of pecan pies had been mingling in the air since dawn. Across the sprawling manicured lawns, the stone steps were still damp with autumn frost. Inside the grand main house, daughters-in-law and aunts hurried back and forth, transferring fine china to the massive dining table. Clara Jenkins had been wearing her apron since 6 in the morning, busy prepping ingredients and meticulously arranging the charcuterie boards for the family's pre-dinner gathering. Even though she hadn't slept a wink the night before, no one bothered to ask how she was doing. To everyone in the room, she was simply the out-of-place daughter-in-law of Richard Sterling, the billionaire corporate magnate, and the wife of Julian Sterling. The stems of the pears need to face inward. You've been a daughter-in-law for 2 years. How do you still not know something this simple? The eldest aunt snapped. Clara immediately lowered her head. I'm sorry, Aunt Margaret. I'll fix it. Even though it was just a misplaced pear, Clara had to apologize as if she had brought shame upon the entire family. As she quietly rearranged the fruit, the aunt clicked her tongue, loud enough for the other relatives sitting nearby to hear. Well, what do you expect? A country girl who suddenly marries into a family like ours obviously has a lot to learn. It's a good thing, Eleanor. Julian's mother is kind enough to guide her. Clara said nothing. Early in her marriage, her face would turn crimson at such remarks, and she would cry silently under her blankets at night. But now, she had learned not to respond. If she argued, she was disrespectful. If she tried to explain, she was making excuses. If she smiled, she was considered immature. If she looked gloomy, she was accused of ruining the family's holiday spirit. Ultimately, the safest expression Clara could wear was a mask of complete indifference. Across the great room, in the mahogany-paneled library, the men were drinking scotch and discussing corporate mergers and real estate. In the center of them sat her husband, Julian Sterling. Wearing a tailored charcoal blazer, he answered his relatives' questions with sharp, concise responses. As an executive director at the family's Manhattan-based industrial manufacturing empire and its primary heir, every word he spoke was flawless. When someone cracked a joke, he merely quirked the corner of his lips. When the conversation shifted to business, his expression immediately turned cold and serious. Julian didn't glance in his wife's direction even once. That was no longer a surprise to Clara. They had driven to Connecticut in the same car, but the entire conversation during the hour-long trip consisted of 3 sentences. Put your seatbelt on. We don't need to stop for coffee. Don't make weird faces in front of my parents. Julian only spoke when necessary. If asked whether he had eaten, he would just nod. If asked if he would be home late, he would frown and ask if she was keeping tabs on him. In his daily life, there was room for the corporation, his parents, and Serena, but there was no place for his wife. Right before the traditional family toast was about to begin, the sound of a car pulling up the gravel driveway echoed outside. It was highly unusual for a guest to arrive late on a day like this. So everyone momentarily stopped what they were doing. The heavy oak front doors opened, and the sharp click of high heels echoed into the great room. The first person whose face hardened wasn't Clara, but Julian's mother, Eleanor. Serena Thorne stood in the foyer, wearing a sleek black designer dress draped with a cream-colored trench coat. Serena's appearance was far too fashionable and icy for a warm Thanksgiving gathering. Despite being the center of attention for dozens of relatives, she didn't look nervous in the slightest. Instead, she looked perfectly composed, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. I apologize for the sudden intrusion. Eleanor stood up, her voice sharp. Where do you think you are? Barging in here like this? As if anticipating Eleanor's reaction, Serena pulled a pristine white envelope from her designer bag. She locked eyes with Julian. Her gaze was a mixture of sorrow, disappointment, and a firm resolve she wanted to prove to someone. I didn't come here because I wanted to, but I think it's time Julian makes a decision. Julian slowly stood up. Serena, go home. Today. If I go home, you'll just avoid me again, won't you? We'll talk later, How long is later going to be? Serena's voice echoed through the grand hall. The relatives began to whisper, and Richard Sterling's face turned to stone. Clara set down the silver serving tray in her hands. A sickening feeling began to creep up from her fingertips. Serena pulled a sonogram photo and a piece of paper that looked like a medical document from the envelope. "I'm pregnant." Instantly, all the noise in the house vanished. Only the faint clatter of a pot lid from the distant kitchen could be heard. Serena continued, her voice trembling slightly. "It's Julian's baby. I'm 9 weeks along." Aunt Margaret covered her mouth in shock. Someone gasped softly. Eleanor marched up to Serena and snatched the documents from her hand. Richard glared at Julian with a terrifying intensity and demanded, "What is the meaning of this?" Julian stared at the sonogram. A brief flash of shock crossed his face, but he quickly hardened his expression. He didn't ask Serena if it was true, nor did he deny it by calling her a liar. To Clara, that silence was clearer than any answer. What was crueler than the fact that Serena was pregnant was the reality that her husband didn't even look at his wife. Julian didn't check Clara's reaction once. He acted as if Clara wasn't even in the room. Or even if she was hurting, it wasn't something worth his consideration. Eleanor frantically approached Clara. "This might not be true. Don't misunderstand." Hearing the word misunderstand, Clara offered a brief, empty smile. Over the past 2 years, she had heard the phrase "don't misunderstand" countless times. She was never allowed to misunderstand. Even when her husband left the house in the middle of the night after a phone call from Serena, she had to believe it was just business. Even when a photo of them standing intimately at a corporate gala was plastered on business news sites. Even when she found out her husband had gone on a business trip with Serena on their wedding anniversary, she was told she was just being overly sensitive. Clara looked down at the diamond ring on her left ring finger. The ring Julian had slipped onto her finger on their wedding day, which had never represented a vow of love. Slowly, she slid it off. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked, startled. Without answering, Clara walked over to the grand fireplace mantel, where family heirloom clocks and holiday decorations sat. Amidst the faint scent of cinnamon and pine, she placed the ring in an empty space next to a candle. The cold, metallic clink sounded deafeningly loud. Only then did Julian look at Clara. Clara Jenkins. It was the first time he had used her full maiden name. Looking straight into her husband's eyes, Clara asked with chilling calmness, "How much longer do I have to repay this family's debt?" "What are you talking about?" Julian snapped. "My father saved your father's life. That's why I became a daughter-in-law in this house. The debt is owed to my father. So why am I the one who always has to pay it back?" Richard spoke up, his face rigid. "Clara, today is a day for family. Let's have this emotional conversation later." "Later, right?" Clara repeated the word. "Conversations about me always happen later. After my husband's corporate affairs are settled, after family events are over, after the elder's pride is protected. But I don't know when that later will ever come." Julian stepped forward and reached for her wrist. But Clara took a step back, perhaps because the gesture felt so foreign. Julian's hand stopped in midair. His wife, who usually approached whenever called, who apologized when he was angry, and who waited exactly where he left her, was avoiding him for the first time. Clara looked at the sonogram in Serena's hand. Then back to Julian. "I won't ask why you can't deny it right now. Just answer me one thing." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes were brimming with unshed tears. "During my time in this house, was I ever, even for a moment, truly your wife?" Julian couldn't answer. In that silence, Clara remembered the day, 2 years ago, when she was first bound to this family. Summers in the Hudson Valley were humid and hot. Sunlight shattered across the apple orchards and the sprawling farmland near the river. Clara's parents, Arthur and Martha Jenkins, grew vegetables and apples on a modest family farm. Though it didn't bring in much money, their hard work was enough to sustain their small family. Arthur was known in town as a quiet but incredibly dependable man. He helped others as if their problems were his own, and never had the heart to collect debts from struggling neighbors. Martha, though sometimes frustrated by her husband's overly generous nature, faithfully stood by his side, tending the farm her whole life. The connection between Richard Sterling and Arthur Jenkins began 20 years ago during a brutal winter storm when the Hudson River partially froze over. Richard, who was just building his empire, got caught in a blizzard while driving up from the city to meet a client. His car skidded off a mountain road and plunged into an icy, overflowing ravine. Arthur, who happened to be driving his truck nearby, risked his own life to pry the car door open and pull Richard from the freezing water. Arthur never bragged about the deed. Even when the town praised him as a hero, he simply said, "I just helped a man out of a ditch." But for Richard, it was profound. As his business empire exploded in wealth, he would visit Arthur's farm, attempting to send lavish gifts and money every holiday. Arthur accepted the small gifts but always returned the checks. "If I take money for helping a man survive, it feels like I'm doing business with a life," Arthur had said. Hearing that, Richard felt even more indebted. Clara had seen Julian a few times during her childhood when Richard brought his son to the Hudson Valley. Julian was 6 years older than her, quiet, and always dressed in pristine, expensive city clothes. But he had once offered her his hand to pull her up when little Clara slipped near the creek. She had cherished that brief memory for a long time. But as adults, they lived in entirely different worlds. Clara studied at a culinary institute in New York, then returned upstate with dreams of opening a bakery using local farm produce. Julian, after studying business at the Ivy League level and abroad, entered his father's corporation and ruthlessly climbed the ranks. When Clara saw photos of Julian in the Wall Street Journal, the boy who had offered her a hand by the creek seemed completely gone. The man in the photos was impeccably groomed, cold, and looked entirely unfazed by human emotion. The topic of their marriage came up after Arthur collapsed in the orchard. Facing a massive heart bypass surgery, Richard immediately transferred Arthur to the best private hospital in Manhattan and offered to cover all medical expenses. Arthur refused, but Richard wouldn't back down. That day, in the hospital corridor, Richard first brought up the idea of marriage to Clara. "I've been thinking about this for a long time. It would be wonderful if you and Julian built a life together." At first, Clara thought she misheard him. "Me and Julian? Your father and I are closer than family. I've watched you grow up, and I believe you can anchor our family beautifully." Richard spoke warmly, but his words carried a weight that was impossible to refuse. In a situation where they were accepting massive financial help for her father's survival, Clara couldn't easily say no. Furthermore, her mother, Martha, viewed marrying into the Sterling family as an absolute miracle. "Julian is incredibly successful. If you marry into a family like that, you'll never have to struggle a day in your life," Martha pleaded. "Mom, you don't marry just to avoid struggling. What about love? Love grows over time. Do you think your father and I were madly in love the day we met?" Martha held her daughter's hands, her eyes pleading. "You know how risky your father's surgery is. And the state of our farm. They're willing to accept you as their daughter. Where else will we find people this generous?" Clara couldn't answer. No one held a gun to her head. But every circumstance pushed her in one direction. She met Julian again at a quiet, exclusive steakhouse in Manhattan. After their parents greeted each other, they deliberately left the two alone. Julian just stared at his Scotch glass without ever meeting Clara's eyes. "Cancel this wedding." Those were the first words out of his mouth. Though taken aback, Clara asked calmly, "You don't want this either, do you?" "I already have someone I'm going to marry." That was the first time Clara heard the name Serena Thorne. Julian explained that he had been dating Serena since business school, and they were planning to marry. However, Richard and Eleanor vehemently opposed Serena. They believed Serena didn't love Julian, but was only after his shares in the company and his wealth. "My father is trying to use you to get rid of Serena. If you accept this marriage, I will probably hate you for the rest of my life." His words sounded more like a threat than a warning. Clara's heart felt heavy. Then you should be the one to refuse him directly. If I refuse, your father will stop funding my father's medical treatments. My father isn't like that. You don't know your father. Julian finally looked straight at Clara. And my parents won't just give up. Do you think they'll let a girl from a poor farming family miss the chance to marry into our money? The words pierced Clara's pride. Please don't speak about my parents like that. If you're offended, prove it. Cancel the wedding. Clara didn't give an answer that day. With her father's surgery looming, she didn't have the courage to say she would reject all the life-saving help. Yet, she also couldn't be sure that marrying a man who openly despised her was the right choice. In the end, accepting the marriage was Clara's own choice. Her father's health, her parents' desperate hopes, Richard's overwhelming debt of gratitude, and the childhood memory of Julian held her back. Above all, Clara foolishly believed that over time, Julian would acknowledge her. She thought that if she kept showing him genuine care, eventually his heart would open. On their wedding day, Julian didn't smile once. In front of hundreds of high society guests and cameras, he played the role of the perfect groom flawlessly. But when they were alone in the bridal suite, he said coldly, "Don't expect me to act like a husband after today." Clara placed her white-gloved hands neatly on her lap. "I won't. I'm also not breaking up with Serena." He said it fully intending to make Clara give up right then and there. But she lowered her head and replied softly, "Just please don't do anything to humiliate my parents in front of others." Julian let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. "In the end, all you care about is your parents' pride. Well, you're only here because of your parents' pride too, aren't you?" For the first time, he fell silent. After the wedding, they moved into a sprawling, modern townhouse on the Upper East Side. The house had high security gates, massive floor-to-ceiling windows, and minimalist designer furniture. But to Clara, it felt colder than a hotel. Eleanor offered to hire a full-time housekeeper so her new daughter-in-law wouldn't have to lift a finger, but Julian refused. "I don't like strangers in my house." Consequently, the household chores naturally fell to Clara. Julian gave her a black credit card for living expenses and informed her that all transaction alerts would go directly to his phone. "Buy only what you need. Don't waste money on useless things." Clara felt humiliated, but she took the card. She had no income of her own. At her parents' urging, she had quit her job at a local bakery as soon as she got engaged. Initially, every time she bought groceries or household items, she kept the receipts. She explained her purchases even though Julian never asked, and if she saw something expensive, she would put it back on the shelf. One day, when she bought cold medicine and Madol at a pharmacy, Julian called her. "What exactly are you buying at a pharmacy that costs that much?" Clara tensed up immediately, as if she had committed a crime. "I wasn't feeling well. If you're sick, go to a doctor. Don't take random over-the-counter junk. You think I'm questioning you because I can't afford a doctor's bill?" Julian snapped. Clara apologized without even understanding why he was angry. Only after he hung up did she realize she had no idea if he wanted her to be frugal or not. The money wasn't the point. Whatever she chose, she was expected to explain and justify it to him. Julian almost always came home late. For the first few months, Clara prepared dinner every night. She learned to cook the perfect medium-rare steak and roasted fingerling potatoes he supposedly liked and set the dining table perfectly. But the food would just grow cold. "I've made dinner. Around what time will you be home?" When she called him, Julian usually answered with deep annoyance. "Did I say I was eating at home?" "No, but just in case." "Don't keep calling me just because of just in case." After that, Clara never called again. She would send a text, and if there was no reply, she ate alone. Eventually, she stopped making food for herself altogether. Eating a solitary meal in a massive house where her husband never returned felt far too pathetic. Julian's parents adored Clara. Eleanor bought her designer bags and clothes, and Richard was satisfied that Julian's public image had stabilized since her arrival. But their love was highly conditional. Even knowing her son was in the wrong, Eleanor would say, "Men get quiet at home when they have a lot of corporate stress. You need to be softer with him, dear." "Eleanor, I think Julian is still seeing Serena. That girl just refuses to let go of my son. You are the wife. You need to hold the reins properly. What am I supposed to do? Make the house feel warm so your husband's heart doesn't wander. Cook good meals, don't nag." Clara tried to believe those words. That if the house was warm, he would come back. That if she was just a little better, Julian would end things with Serena. So she learned to cook his favorite meals perfectly, ironed his custom dress shirts herself, and left the porch light on when he came home late. But even the porch light annoyed Julian. "I told you not to wait up for me. I just left the light on." It's the same thing as waiting. From that day on, Clara turned off every light before going to bed. She bought a small black notebook. The cover was plain, small enough to fit in her hand. Initially, she bought it to write down the foods Julian liked and disliked. But at some point, the contents of the notebook shifted. Don't call late at night. Don't ask if he wants dinner first. Don't look at his phone even if Serena's name pops up. Don't offer opinions on his corporate work. Don't show that our marriage is failing in front of his parents. When spending money, pick the cheapest option. Don't call mom and dad upstate too often. If you need to cry, cry where Julian isn't. Clara treated these as absolute rules. She believed that if she followed them, they wouldn't fight. But in reality, the more rules she added, the smaller her space in that house became. On their first wedding anniversary, Clara baked a small cake. She used the artisanal apple cranberry preserves her mother had sent from the farm and decorated the cream beautifully. She wasn't expecting a grand celebration. She just hoped they could sit across from each other at the dining table for the first time and just talk. Julian came home past 11 p.m. His trench coat smelled of an expensive perfume she didn't recognize. "Do you know what today is?" Clara asked. Julian kicked off his dress shoes and checked his Rolex. "I have an early board meeting tomorrow. Today is our first anniversary." He looked at the cake on the table. For a fraction of a second, he looked like he might feel guilty. But then he said coldly, "I have no intention of celebrating this marriage." Clara's fingertips went numb. "Can't we just have one slice?" "Clara." Julian rubbed his temples as if exhausted. "I told you from the start. Don't create your own meaning out of this, and then get hurt when I don't fulfill it. That's not my responsibility." He walked straight upstairs. Clara stood in front of the dining table for a long time. Eventually, without ever lighting the candle, she put the cake in the fridge. 3 days later, while throwing the moldy cake in the trash, she doubted for the first time how long she could hold on to this futile hope. Even so, Clara couldn't easily give up. She felt a sense of responsibility because she had chosen this marriage, and she couldn't bear to look like a failure to her parents. Above all, the image of the little boy offering her his hand by the creek still lingered in her heart. She believed that person wasn't entirely gone, just hiding somewhere deep inside. Then, one snowy winter evening, Julian brought Serena home. Clara was making a hearty beef stew in the kitchen. Hearing the front door open, she peeked her head out, feeling a spark of hope, but she froze when she saw them together. Serena's hand was casually looped through Julian's arm, and he wasn't pulling away. "We have some legal documents to review, so we're stopping by for a bit," Julian stated. His tone wasn't asking for permission. It was the voice of someone dictating a finalized decision. Serena slowly looked around the house and smiled. "Cozy. Much nicer than I imagined." "Clara decorated it," Julian said. "I just organized things a little at a time," Clara murmured. "This house was a wedding gift from Julian's parents, right?" Serena asked. Clara knew the underlying sting of the question, but merely nodded. Serena looked at the spread of food on the kitchen island. "Oh, perfect timing, we haven't had dinner yet." Julian took off his coat without asking Clara. "Just set out something simple." Clara stared at her husband for a long moment. Julian furrowed his brows, uncomfortable with the gaze. What? Nothing. She retreated to the kitchen. She divided the portions meant for 2 into 3 plates and pulled out extra sides. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the serving spoon twice. When dinner started, Serena immediately dominated the conversation with corporate talk. Acquisitions, shares, and hedge fund investments that Clara couldn't comprehend filled the air. Julian, who rarely spoke a word to Clara, explained things in long, engaging sentences to Serena. When Serena made a witty remark, he even offered a faint smile. Clara sat across from them, just watching. She couldn't remember the last time she saw her husband smile from this close. Serena tasted the stew and praised it. "This is really good. You're so lucky. Clara's such a great cook." "I can't cook to save my life," Julian replied nonchalantly. "She just stays at home all day. She has plenty of time." That single sentence rendered every effort Clara had made that day entirely meaningless. Waking up at dawn, scrubbing the house, compiling the holiday catering lists sent by her mother-in-law, calling the hospital to check on her father's cardiology appointments, grocery shopping, and then cooking for over 2 hours. All of it was dismissed as something she only did because she stays at home all day. Serena smiled at Julian. "Still, I'm jealous. Coming home to someone cooking and waiting for you." Julian's expression tightened for a moment, but he poured water into his glass and said, "When people get too used to things, they stop noticing." "Thank you." Clara put her spoon down. She didn't know if his thank you was directed at her or Serena, but one thing was crystal clear. The most unnecessary person at this table was the one who had cooked the food. After dinner, Serena and Julian sat side by side on the living room sofa, staring at a laptop screen. Their shoulders were practically touching. While washing the dishes, Clara intentionally turned the water on full blast. She hoped it would drown out the sound of their laughter, but Serena's bright giggles pierced right through the rushing water. After finishing the dishes, she walked out and saw Serena adjusting Julian's tie. "Don't wear this one tomorrow. Wear the navy silk. You have that big pitch to the investors." Clara stopped in her tracks. As a wife, she didn't even know his schedule for tomorrow, but Serena knew exactly which tie he should wear. Julian noticed Clara standing there and said, "Make us 2 cups of coffee." Clara stared at him for a second, then asked softly, "Can I have a cup with you?" Julian looked up, as if she had asked something utterly absurd. "We're discussing corporate strategy. I'll just sit quietly, I won't talk." "Why would you need to do that?" That short question shattered Clara's heart. When a wife asks to sit next to her husband, he asks why she would need to do that. Clara forced a smile. "You're right. Why would I?" She placed the 2 mugs of coffee in front of them and walked upstairs. As soon as the bedroom door clicked shut, her legs gave out. Sitting on the edge of the mattress, she covered her mouth with both hands to muffle her sobs. Downstairs, their conversation continued. Serena said something, and Julian chuckled softly. Listening to that laugh, she pulled the small black notebook from her nightstand drawer. She wrote a new rule. "When my husband is with the person he loves, do not interrupt." Beneath it, she added one more line. "Do not hope that if I endure this, one day he will understand." Her pen hovered over the paper. She stared at the sentence she had just written for a long time. Until now, all the rules in the book were about preventing Julian from getting angry. But this last sentence was different. It was the first warning directed not at her husband, but at herself. Enduring does not make you loved. Suffering in silence does not make the other person feel guilty. When someone takes another's sacrifices for granted for too long, they don't realize the weight of those sacrifices. They simply view them as their rightful privilege. Clara wiped her tears and closed the notebook. That night, even after Serena left, Julian didn't come up to the master bedroom. When the living room lights clicked off and the house was swallowed by darkness, Clara lay alone in bed, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know if the boy who once offered her his hand by the creek and the man who just escorted another woman out downstairs were even the same person. Perhaps people don't change over time, Perhaps we just choose to remember the version of them we desperately want to see. Under the covers, she touched the wedding band on her left hand. It was still there, but strangely, it felt infinitely heavier than before. She wasn't ready to leave yet. She didn't have the courage to tell her parents the truth, and she wasn't strong enough to admit her marriage was a complete failure. But for the first time that day, Clara thought, if I disappeared from this house, who would notice first? Julian, my in-laws, or the credit card company sending the transaction alerts? The fact that absolutely no one came to mind kept her awake for a long time. From that day on, Clara stopped waiting for Julian to come home. When evening fell, she only cooked enough food for herself. Julian's silverware, which she always set out on the right side of the table, was now left in the drawer. She didn't turn on the porch light, and even when she heard his sports car pull into the driveway late at night, she didn't open the bedroom door. Julian didn't notice the changes for the first few days. The house was still immaculate, his shirts were still pressed, and the fridge was still stocked. But one early morning, returning from a late-night client dinner, he stood perfectly still in the pitch-black foyer for a long time. Before, no matter how late it was, there was always a warm, dim lamp glowing in the corner of the living room, and he would often find Clara asleep on the sofa under a throw blanket. That night there was no one. Julian turned the lights on himself, got a glass of water, and walked upstairs. When he opened the bedroom door, Clara was sleeping with her back to him on the far edge of the bed. Unconsciously, he stepped closer to check if she was really asleep. Clara didn't move an inch. "Clara," Julian called out softly. There was no answer. In the past, Clara would have woken up just hearing his footsteps. She would have fetched him warm water, asked if he was tired, and checked his suit for the next day. Julian, who had always found all of that suffocating and annoying, suddenly found the house overwhelmingly, deafeningly quiet without it. He stood there for a moment, then closed the door and walked into his study. Only after the door clicked shut did Clara slowly open her eyes. While pretending to sleep, her palms had grown sweaty. The fact that intense anxiety hit her before any sense of comfort when her husband approached was deeply tragic. She felt like she was losing her mind in this house. Her mood swung wildly based on Julian's tone and expressions, and her heart pounded aggressively every time his phone rang. Even when Julian wasn't angry, she was already formulating apologies in her head. Even when she did nothing wrong, she endlessly analyzed what she might have messed up. One day, Clara stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror for a long time. Her makeupless face was pale, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. The bright, smiling girl in her pre-wedding photos felt like a total stranger. She pulled the black notebook out of the drawer, then shoved it back in. She didn't want to add any more rules. She realized that the more rules she followed, the less safe she felt. She was just erasing who she was. It was around this time that Clara decided to go back to work. Initially, she looked for remote jobs. She thought about selling artisanal preserves and baked goods online, but she was terrified of registering a business and using their home address without Julian's permission. Eventually, she found a job opening at a small independent bakery in a trendy neighborhood in Brooklyn. The bakery was called The Hearth. It was a renovated rustic brick building, and the glass display cases were filled with exquisite pastries. Cream-filled brioche, dark chocolate puddings, and seasonal fruit tarts made from locally sourced ingredients. Just looking at the photos online, she stared at the screen for a long time. This was what she wanted to do. The next day, after Julian left for his corporate headquarters, she took the subway to Brooklyn. As she opened the door to the shop, the warm, comforting aroma of freshly baked bread washed over her. Behind the counter, a man in his mid-30s was prepping dough. When Clara mentioned she was there for the job opening, the man dusted the flour off his apron and smiled. "I'm David. I have experience in baking. I went to culinary school in upstate New York. Before I got married, I worked at a bakery," Clara said. "Married?" Clara looked down at the ring on her left hand and replied softly, "Yes." Sensing her hesitation, David didn't pry any further. Instead, he led her to the kitchen and suggested a quick practical test. Clara had brought a small jar of the apple cranberry preserves her mother had sent. She quickly whipped up a batch of delicate, airy scones, filled them with the preserves, and topped them with crushed candied pecans. Her hands hadn't worked like this in ages, but the moment she touched the dough, her muscle memory fired up. As she measured ingredients and checked oven temperatures, a vitality she hadn't felt in years returned to her face. David tasted a piece of the finished pastry and went silent for a moment. Clara grew anxious. Is there something wrong with it? No, exactly the opposite. David set the plate down and smiled warmly. With skills like this, there isn't much I can teach you, he asked. Can you start next week? Clara was thrilled, but after checking the hours and pay, she hesitated. Is there a problem? No, it's just that my house is a bit far from here. The shift is 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., so I should be able to commute. And weekends alternate, right? Eventually, Clara agreed to take the job. On the subway ride home, she found herself smiling unconsciously. How long had it been since someone actually acknowledged her talent? In the Sterling family, her cooking was just an expected duty. To Julian, it was just something she did because she had plenty of time. But David called it a skill. Clara didn't tell Julian she started working. She was afraid he would forbid it if she asked for permission, and she felt she would doubt her own choice if she had to justify it to him. She woke up early, finished the household chores, and took the train. She returned by late afternoon, prepped dinner, and cleaned up so perfectly that Julian never noticed a thing. Working at the hearth was an entirely different universe for Clara. Her co-workers didn't view her as the billionaire heir's wife or the Sterling family's charity case. They treated her as a highly capable colleague with a genius palate. Clara's apple cranberry scones quickly became a massive hit with the local customers. When a regular ordered 10 boxes for a corporate gift, David wrote the baker's name on a small chalkboard next to the pastry case. Apple cranberry scones. Crafted by Clara Jenkins. Clara stared at the writing, unable to look away. Why did you write my name? A baker should be proud of their work, right? You don't need to put my name up there. Why not? It's nothing to be ashamed of. Clara couldn't answer. Since getting married, she had almost never heard her own name used as an individual. At her in-laws, she was Julian's wife or the daughter-in-law. At corporate galas, she was introduced as the director's +1. Even Julian only used her name when he was angry. Seeing those 3 words on that little chalkboard was incredibly, overwhelmingly moving. That night, Clara felt that the face reflected in the dark subway window looked different. Though physically exhausted, her eyes were alive. She promised herself that, with her first paycheck, she would send a small gift to her parents and buy a nice apron for herself with the remainder. But this double life couldn't stay hidden forever. One Friday afternoon, Julian was being chauffeured through Brooklyn with Serena after a pitch meeting nearby. Serena mentioned a famous new bakery and asked the driver to pull over. Julian wasn't interested. But since they had time before their next meeting, he walked in with her. The door chimed. Clara, who was folding pastry boxes behind the counter, looked up. Instantly, the smile vanished from her face. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. Clara was wearing a crisp white button-down with a tan canvas apron, her hair tied up neatly. The woman who moved like a ghost through their massive townhouse, always looking somber and anxious, was now smiling brilliantly and greeting customers. The sight was entirely jarring to Julian. Serena was the first to approach. Clara, what are you doing here? The attention of the customers in the shop turned to them. Though panicking internally, Clara answered calmly. I work here. I wanted to. Did Julian give you permission? Hearing Serena's question, Julian's expression hardened. The implication that his wife needed his permission to hold a job in public made him feel oddly defensive. Yet, he didn't stand up for Clara. Since when? Julian demanded. About 2 months. 2 months. Julian's voice dropped dangerously low. without telling me. Clara, anticipating his rage, gripped the fabric of her apron. I figured if I told you, you'd forbid it. So you just lied to me. I never lied. You never once asked what I do all day, did you? Julian was momentarily speechless. David came out from the kitchen, noticing the tension. Is there a problem? Clara quickly intervened. It's fine, David. Julian eyed David from head to toe. The protective way the man looked at Clara deeply irritated him. Are you the owner? I am. And who are you? Her husband. Julian stated it more aggressively than necessary. David gave a brief nod. I've heard the story. That single sentence struck a nerve. You've been talking about me? Julian glared at Clara. Clara shook her head. I just told him I was married. Serena watched the friction between the three of them with immense amusement. She pointed at the scones in the case and said cheerfully, Julian, they say Clara made these. Let's try one. Julian didn't answer. Clara placed a scone on a small plate and slid it across the counter. She tried to hide her trembling fingers, but Julian noticed. Try it. Does it even matter right now? Because this is the first time you're acknowledging my work. Clara looked him dead in the eye. In the past, she would have averted her gaze immediately. But not today. Julian eventually picked up a fork and took a bite. The tartness of the cranberries and the rich, buttery crumb blended perfectly. It was far better than he expected. But he offered no praise. How long are you planning on doing this? I want to keep working here. Are you lacking something at home? I'm not doing this for money. Then why? Clara thought for a moment before speaking softly. Because I don't want to forget that I am a person who is actually capable of doing something. Julian furrowed his brow, genuinely unable to comprehend her logic. Sensing the mood shifting, Serena grabbed Julian's arm. We're going to be late, let's go. Julian wanted to order his wife to quit on the spot, but with the customers and David watching, he bit his tongue. We'll talk about this at home. As he turned away, Clara subconsciously let out a massive sigh of relief. That night, Julian came home earlier than usual. Clara was waiting on the sofa, fully expecting him to demand she quit, having prepared her arguments. Julian threw his coat over a chair and asked, How much do they pay you? Hourly. Monthly. Clara stated the amount. Julian looked at her in sheer disbelief. You commute to Brooklyn every single day on the subway for that kind of change? To me, it's not small change. You have my black card, and every time I swipe that card, you get an alert on your phone, right? What's the problem with that? Clara looked at him and answered quietly. I have to justify buying painkillers. I have to explain why I sent a box of fruit to my parents upstate. If I have my own money, at the very least, I don't have to beg for permission for every little thing I buy. Julian's face turned to stone. When have I ever told you to beg for permission? There are things that are clearly understood without being said out loud. Here you go again, acting like the ultimate victim. Clara's eyes wavered. But this time, she didn't apologize. Have you ever stopped to think about who made me the victim? What? Nothing. Clara stood up. Julian grabbed her wrist. Why are you walking away in the middle of a conversation? Clara looked down at his hand wrapped around her wrist. Julian expected her to cower, but she calmly pulled her arm free. I have an early shift tomorrow. You're actually going back to that bakery? Yes. And if I forbid it? Clara paused, then answered, I'll go anyway. Julian stood frozen, hearing a defiance he had never heard from her before. Clara walked past him and up the stairs. From that day on, Julian developed an unnatural obsession with his wife's job. When he got home from the office, he checked to see if she was back, and if she was late, he interrogated her about her shift. He convinced himself he was doing it to protect the family's image and security. But one day, when he happened to park his car near the bakery and saw Clara laughing with David through the window, he realized the feeling wasn't just concern. David was carrying a heavy sack of flour, and Clara was holding the door open for him. They were talking about something, laughing freely. The radiant smile on Clara's face was something Julian had never seen inside their townhouse. He stared at them from his car for a long time. It made him furious. How could the woman who always looked so miserable around him laugh so brightly with that man? The fact that there was a side of Clara he had absolutely no access to infuriated him. Julian got out of the car and walked into the shop. Clara was startled. "What are you doing here?" "I had a meeting nearby." It was a lie. When David greeted him, Julian just gave a stiff nod. He ordered a pastry made by Clara and sat by the window. Hyper-aware of his gaze, Clara continued working, taking orders, packing boxes, handing a free cookie to a toddler. Julian watched it all in total silence. Clara was needed here. Customers called her by name. Co-workers asked her opinion. And David discussed new recipes with her. At home, she was someone expected to be invisible. But here, the more she existed, the more she was celebrated. Julian felt an unexplainable gnawing anxiety. When her shift ended, he walked up to the counter. "We're going home together. I'll take the subway." "Why take the subway when I have the car waiting?" "Just in case you need to go meet Serena." Clara said it so casually that Julian's gaze turned lethal. "Are you mocking me?" "No. I'm just stating what usually happens." David watched the exchange closely from the back. Julian didn't argue further, just grabbed her bag and walked out to the car. During the drive back to the Upper East Side, a heavy silence filled the vehicle. Julian broke it first. "Are you close with that guy?" "He's your boss." "I know. So why ask?" "Because you were laughing together." Clara looked out the window at the passing city lights and replied flatly, "People usually laugh when they talk to each other. But you never laugh when you're with me." The words struck Julian harder than he expected. Clara slowly turned to look at him. "Has there ever been a single thing about me that made you smile?" Julian had no answer. Clara turned her face back to the window. In the reflection of the glass, her face was expressionless, but her eyes held a profound, deeply buried exhaustion. A few days later, while preparing breakfast, Clara suddenly felt a wave of intense nausea. Just the smell of the cooking eggs made her want to vomit, and she nearly collapsed onto the kitchen floor. Initially, she thought she was just exhausted from the commute, but then she realized her period was weeks late. Before heading to Brooklyn, she stopped at a CVS and bought a pregnancy test. She paid with her own debit card from her bakery wages, so Julian wouldn't get an alert. In the small bathroom at the bakery, her hands shook violently as she waited for the result. 2 pink lines. Clara stared at the little plastic stick for a long time, forgetting to breathe. An overwhelming rush of emotion, an indistinguishable mix of terror and joy filled her chest. She placed a hand over her flat stomach. In that cold, hostile house, a new life connected to her was growing. A private clinic appointment confirmed the pregnancy. The doctor told her that since it was early, she needed to avoid stress and exhaustion. Looking at the tiny blinking dot on the ultrasound screen, a tear slipped down her cheek. "Is your husband not here?" the nurse asked. Clara shook her head. "He's busy with corporate matters." The lie slipped out naturally. Leaving the clinic, Clara considered calling Julian. She felt that regardless of the state of their marriage, he had the right to know about his child. A small, desperate hope flared up that maybe, just maybe, Julian would change once he heard the news. However, she lowered her phone. She didn't want to use a baby to chain her husband to her. She wanted to tell him face to face, properly. Coincidentally, Julian's birthday was exactly a week away. Clara decided to make a special dinner that night and carefully break the news. She went to a boutique and bought a tiny pair of baby socks, white, embroidered with a little yellow duck. She placed the socks and the ultrasound photo into a small gift box, along with a short letter. "Even though this baby was born from a marriage you didn't want, I hope at the very least they can be loved." After writing that, Clara stared at it, then erased the second half. It felt like passing her own trauma onto the child before they were even born. Instead, she wrote, "A new family member is coming to us." On Julian's birthday, Clara cooked a lavish meal of all his favorites and baked a small cake. She remembered the cake she had thrown in the trash on their anniversary, but she desperately wanted to believe this time would be different. By 8 p.m., Julian still wasn't home. Clara texted him, "Can you come home a bit early tonight? I have something important to tell you." No reply. At 9 p.m., a text came in, but it wasn't from Julian. It was from Serena. "Can we meet briefly? It's something important regarding Julian." Initially, Clara ignored it, but Serena immediately sent a photo. An ultrasound photo. The phone nearly slipped from Clara's grip. Serena sent the address of a high-end hotel lounge near the bakery. After hesitating for a long time, Clara hailed a cab. She felt that if she didn't see this with her own eyes, she would imagine far worse things all night. Serena was sitting by the window. As soon as Clara arrived, she smiled and said she had already ordered tea. "You look terrible. What did you want to show me?" Serena pulled a medical envelope from her designer bag. "The photo I just sent you." Clara didn't sit down. "Whose baby is it?" Serena paused, then stated flatly, "Julian's." Clara gripped the back of the plush chair. "Don't lie to me. Why would you think I'm lying? Has Julian ever told you otherwise?" Serena offered a bitter, mocking smile. "What exactly has he told you about us?" The question was incredibly precise and unbelievably cruel. Serena pushed a document that looked like an OBGYN confirmation letter across the table. Clara couldn't focus her eyes to read it properly. Her vision blurred, and her ears were ringing. "I'm 9 weeks along," Serena said. Clara remembered her own gestational age. Almost exactly the same time. "Does Julian know?" "He knows, but since he hasn't officially taken over as CEO from his father yet, a messy divorce now would cause a scandal for the board. So he's waiting for the right time." Serena looked at Clara's left hand. "Let's be honest. You know this marriage is a sham. Julian has loved me from the start. No matter how perfectly you play the role of the devoted housewife, that fact will never change." Clara fought every instinct telling her to place a protective hand over her own stomach. She absolutely could not let Serena know she was pregnant too. "So, what do you want from me?" Clara asked. "Divorce him," Serena said, her voice soft but venomous. "This baby needs a father." Something inside Clara entirely shattered. The baby in my stomach needs a father too. But she couldn't say those words out loud. The moment she revealed her own pregnancy, it felt like both innocent lives would just become bargaining chips for the adults' twisted power struggles. Clara stared at the document on the table, then stood up. "I will hear it directly from Julian. Do you think he'll be honest with you?" "I'll be the judge of that." When she finally returned to the townhouse, the icing on the birthday cake had started to melt. The elaborate meal was ice cold, and the small gift box sat quietly on the table. Julian didn't get home until almost midnight. Clara was sitting in the dark on the sofa. As soon as he opened the door, Julian noticed her rigid posture. "You're still awake. Where were you earlier?" "I was out." "With Serena?" Julian froze for a split second before answering smoothly. "Just briefly." "For business?" "What kind of business?" Clara pulled her phone out and pulled up the ultrasound photo Serena had texted her. "Is this corporate business too?" All emotion drained from Julian's face. "Where did you get that?" His reaction alone made Clara's heart plummet into an abyss. "It was true. I'm looking into it," Julian said defensively. "Looking into what?" "It's true. Serena is pregnant. There is zero proof that it's mine." "Then why didn't you tell me?" Julian loosened his silk tie, looking exhausted and annoyed. "Why would I tell you about something that isn't even confirmed? I am your wife." Suddenly, her title was supposed to mean something. Julian scoffed. "Are we really playing that card now?" Clara's face turned completely white. Julian realized what he had just said. But true to form, he didn't apologize. To mask his misstep, he spoke even more coldly. I am handling this situation. Do not interfere. How can I not interfere? What do you think we are? A normal married couple? That single sentence made Clara look at the small gift box on the table. The existence of her own child, which she had so desperately wanted to share tonight, rose to her throat and was violently swallowed back down. Julian noticed the cake and asked, "What is this?" "Oh, it's my birthday." He checked his watch as if it were a chore. Clara couldn't laugh or cry. "What's in the box?" he asked. "Nothing." Clara quickly grabbed the box. Julian reached out, but Clara stepped back. "Clara, don't." "Why?" "Because there is no longer a reason to give it to you." She clutched the box to her chest and walked up the stairs. Julian started to follow her but stopped. His eyes fell on the unlit candles stuck in the melting cake. That night, Clara shoved the baby socks deep into the bottom of her drawer and wrote a new line in her notebook. Do not use a child to beg for love. A few days later, Thanksgiving arrived. Despite feeling incredibly ill and emotionally drained, Clara had no choice but to attend the family gathering in Greenwich. Eleanor had called, stressing that many board members and extended family were attending, so she needed to be there at dawn to oversee the catering. You must play the perfect hostess to protect Julian's image, Eleanor had said. Clara simply replied, yes. The day before Thanksgiving, Serena had called Julian repeatedly. Julian ignored the calls but read the texts. He already knew that parts of the medical documents Serena had shown him were highly suspicious. He confirmed she was pregnant, but the timeline and the dates she claimed they were intimately together didn't line up. Julian had also ordered his corporate audit team to investigate Serena's recent activities at the firm. His suspicions had peaked when he received reports that Serena had been secretly contacting rival hedge funds. However, he hadn't explained a single word of this to Clara. He thought he would tell her once he had absolute, irrefutable proof. He arrogantly believed he was in total control of the situation, so his wife simply needed to sit quietly and wait. He had no idea what consequences his silence would breed. On Thanksgiving Day, Serena crashed the family gathering and announced her pregnancy to the entire Sterling clan. Julian chose to remain silent, calculating that if he outright denied it, Serena might destroy evidence of her corporate espionage. To him, it was a strategic business move. But to Clara, it was a public admission of his infidelity. After leaving her wedding ring on the fireplace mantel and walking away, Eleanor rushed after her. "Clara! Wait! Julian will explain everything." Clara took off her apron and draped it over a chair. "Did you know about this, Eleanor?" "No. I swear I just heard it today. So you must trust us." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. "It's not about trust, Clara. She says there's a baby. We have to verify the facts first." Hearing that, Clara slowly nodded. "Right. The child's existence must be verified, while I am just expected to sit in the dark and endure it. Just like when I told you I thought Julian and Serena were still seeing each other, you told me I needed to be a better wife. You told me to make the house warmer and not to nag." Eleanor's face tightened. "Did you think I said that because I hate you? I just wanted you to save your marriage. Why is saving this marriage solely my responsibility? Julian is the one who steps out. Why is the person waiting by the door the only one who has to bleed to keep it shut?" Eleanor was at a loss for words. At that moment, Julian stormed into the hallway. "We need to talk privately," Clara asked without even looking at him. "Is that baby yours?" "It's not confirmed yet." "Then why didn't you deny it in front of your family just now? It's complicated to explain right now. Always. Later, isn't it?" Julian lowered his voice, aware of the lingering guests. "Stop acting emotionally. I am handling it." Clara let out a hollow laugh. "You're always handling everything yourself, without telling me anything, without caring for a second what it does to my mind. This isn't the time. What kind of place is this? Clara gestured toward the grand dining hall, where the Thanksgiving feast sat untouched. This is a place where your family's corporate pride matters more than my soul, isn't it? When Julian tried to grab her arm, Clara yanked it away. Don't touch me. Julian's hand froze. Clara looked right through him. I am not going home tonight. What are you talking about? I want to be alone. Running away won't solve anything. Staying here hasn't solved anything either. Clara grabbed her small overnight bag from the coat closet. She had packed it a day earlier, sensing a breaking point was near. She knew that if Serena actually showed up at the estate, she wouldn't survive another night in this family. Julian blocked the front door. Where are you going? You don't need to know. Clara. You never once cared where I was, or what I did all day. Don't start asking now. She pushed past him and walked out into the crisp November air. The relatives stared at her from the dining room windows, but Clara didn't lower her head. Once she got into an Uber, her legs violently shook and she could barely breathe. But she didn't turn back. She went straight to their Upper East Side townhouse. She opened her closet and threw her clothes into a suitcase. She hadn't brought much when she married, just a few outfits, her baking tools, and a small photo album from her parents. When she pulled the small box containing the baby socks from the bottom drawer, the tears finally spilled over. She collapsed onto the bed, clutching the box to her chest. I'm so sorry, she whispered to the baby that wasn't even showing yet. Mommy is so scared that she's taking your father away from you. But if I stay here, I feel like I'm going to completely disappear. After crying until her eyes were swollen, she searched for legal aid clinics on her phone. She decided not to file for divorce immediately. She didn't want them to claim she was making hysterical, emotional decisions. Her plan was to find a safe place first, then communicate strictly through a lawyer. She left a short sticky note on the granite kitchen island. I want a separation. I will contact you when I'm ready. Please do not look for me. Her wedding ring was already sitting on the mantel in Connecticut. She turned her phone off entirely and left the house. Initially, she thought about fleeing to her parents' farm in the Hudson Valley, but she knew Julian's security team would look there first. Her parents would likely panic and urge her to go back to her billionaire husband. With the help of a coworker from the bakery, she found a cheap, tiny apartment in Beacon, New York, a quiet, artsy town far enough from the city. She messaged David, the bakery owner, saying she had to take a leave of absence for personal reasons. David didn't pry. He simply replied, "If you need anything, just call." That night, after Clara vanished, Julian had a catastrophic blowout with Serena at the Connecticut estate. "Why the hell did you come here?" he roared. Serena fake cried, dabbing her eyes. "Because you were avoiding me, and you wouldn't even deny it in front of your family, because you know it's yours." "Fine. We'll do a DNA test immediately." Serena's expression faltered. "Now you're doubting me? The dates line up. Why would I lie to you?" Julian stared at her with absolute ice in his veins. "I intend to find out." He immediately ordered his driver to take him back to Manhattan. He assumed that, no matter how furious she was, Clara would be at home. In the past, no matter how deeply he wounded her, she always stayed to guard their house. When he unlocked the front door, the townhouse was pitch black. "Clara!" No answer. Julian ran upstairs and ripped open the closet doors. Clara's clothes were gone. The cheap drugstore lotions she kept on her vanity and the small framed photo of her parents by the bed were missing. He found the sticky note on the kitchen island. His face drained of color as he read the 2 short sentences. Julian frantically dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. He called her parents in the Hudson Valley, but they said she wasn't there. Eleanor called him in a panic, asking what happened, but he lied, saying Clara went away to clear her head. The next morning, Julian went straight to the hearth in Brooklyn. David blocked him at the counter. "Where is she?" Julian demanded. "I don't know." "Bullshit. You know. She texted me saying she needs time off for personal reasons. That's it. You have her new number or her address, give it to me." David's expression hardened. Even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you. Julian fought the urge to throw a punch. You are hiding another man's wife. Clara doesn't belong to anyone. Julian's eyes narrowed dangerously. David didn't back down an inch. Before you go tearing the city apart looking for her, maybe you should sit down and think about why she ran in the first place. Hearing that, Julian still couldn't accept he was the villain. He convinced himself Clara had just misunderstood Serena's lies. He truly believed that if he just laid out the audit reports and the facts, she would come right back. He dispatched his corporate security team and his executive assistant to track her down. But Clara hadn't touched his black credit card and had burned her old SIM card. She had withdrawn cash from her own meager bakery wages and left zero digital footprint. After a few days, Julian's frantic anxiety morphed into raw anger. He checked his phone obsessively during board meetings, and when he went home, he paced through the empty, massive rooms. Traces of Clara were everywhere. A meticulously dated label on a Tupperware container in the fridge. A note in the laundry room detailing exactly how his custom collars needed to be pressed. In the master bath, a half-empty bottle of her cheap vanilla lotion. Julian stared at it for a long time, suddenly realizing he didn't even know what his own wife naturally smelled like. On the 7th night, he sat in his home office, drinking scotch straight from the bottle. Serena was blowing up his phone, but he ignored her. The audit team had just delivered the final report. Serena had been meeting with a rival hedge fund, and there was concrete proof that highly classified internal data had been leaked from Julian's accounts. Furthermore, the OB/GYN clinic listed on the sonogram confirmed the dates had been altered. Julian finally had the absolute proof that Serena had conned him. Yet, he had absolutely no way to tell this to Clara. Carrying the bottle of scotch, he stumbled upstairs to the master bedroom. While desperately tearing through Clara's nightstand drawers looking for a clue to where she went, he found a small black notebook wedged in the back. It was a plain black moleskine. Initially, Julian thought it was a ledger for her bakery expenses. But when he flipped to the first page, his own name was written at the top. Things Julian hates. He involuntarily read the next few lines. Don't call late at night. Don't ask if he wants dinner first. Don't wait up with the porch light on. When spending money, pick the cheapest option. If you buy painkillers, justify it. Don't ask questions even if Serena's name flashes on his phone. If Julian is angry, do not ask why. Apologize immediately. Don't call mom and dad too often. If you need to cry, never cry in front of Julian. Julian's fingers stopped working. He mechanically turned page after page. Every few days, a new, agonizing rule was added. Words he had spat out in momentary irritation had become absolute laws that Clara lived and died by. Today, I bought cold medicine and he called me. He thinks I'm wasting his money. Next time, I just need to endure the pain. I made an anniversary cake. Julian said he has no intention of celebrating this marriage. Do not create your own meaning out of things anymore. Serena came to the house. It's been so long since I saw Julian smile. He never smiles like that when he looks at me. Do not hope that if I endure this, he will ever understand. Julian took a ragged, shaky breath. The edges of the pages were warped and crinkled water damage, tear stains that had soaked the paper and dried. The last few pages were written with a heavier, more resolute hand. I started working. Today, for the first time, someone wrote my name on a chalkboard. I felt like I hadn't been entirely erased from the world. Julian came to the bakery. He doesn't understand why I work. He thinks I just want spending money. I need my own choices, far more than I need money. And on the very last page, a single, devastating sentence. Do not use a child to beg for love. A child. Clutching the notebook, Julian frantically tore through the rest of the drawer. Inside a small jewelry pouch Clara used, he found a crumpled pharmacy receipt. The name of a private OB/GYN clinic and the date of an appointment were printed on it. All the blood drained from Julian's face. He crushed the receipt in his fist, completely paralyzed. The moment he realized Clara was pregnant, a montage slammed into his brain. Clara instinctively moving to cover her stomach on Thanksgiving, the small gift box she had guarded with her life on his birthday. How pale and sick she had looked in the mornings recently. It all violently clicked together. He finally understood what she had tried to tell him that night. Julian collapsed onto the floor beside the bed. While he had been busy running background checks to verify Serena's fake pregnancy, his wife had gone to a clinic entirely alone to confirm their actual child. She had prepared a cake and a gift to share the greatest news of their lives, only to be ambushed by his mistress. And when she gave him one final, desperate chance to explain himself, he had spat in her face. "What do you think we are, a normal married couple?" Julian buried his face in his hands. For the first time in his privileged, untouchable life, he was more terrified of what he had become in Clara's eyes than of the corporate scandal Serena was about to cause. The reason Clara didn't come back wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Getting rid of Serena wouldn't fix this. Clara was terrified of him. Under his roof, she was so oppressed she couldn't even buy a box of Midol without a panic attack. He had always told himself he wasn't a monster because he never laid a hand on her. But in this notebook, Clara was shrinking every single day, obsessively monitoring his every breath and tone. With trembling hands, Julian dialed her number again. Still disconnected. He left a voicemail. "Clara." His voice cracked on her name. "You don't have to tell me where you are. And I won't demand that you come back. Just please, let me know you're safe." He paused, fighting the knot in his throat. "I read your notebook. I shouldn't have invaded your privacy, but I read it." He squeezed his eyes shut. "I was always so angry because I thought you were just stupidly quiet. But I realize now, it wasn't that you weren't speaking. I just aggressively refused to listen." Julian couldn't find the right words for a long time. For a man who had practically never apologized in his 32 years of life, the word sorry felt foreign and entirely insufficient. But it was the only word he had. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the phone. "And about the baby. If it's true, I swear to God I won't leave you alone to handle it. But I won't use it to force you back into this house. Just contact me when you're ready." He ended the recording. The screen remained blank. He pressed the black notebook against his chest. The townhouse remained dead silent. He used to think Clara's silence was a peaceful convenience. Now he knew it was the silence of a woman who had completely given up on him. At that exact moment, in a drafty, tiny studio apartment in Beacon, Clara stared at the voicemail notification on her new burner phone. The number wasn't saved, but she knew exactly who it was. She hovered her thumb over the play button, then pulled it away. Deep in her womb, a tiny life she couldn't even feel moving yet was growing. She gently cradled her stomach and whispered, "Just wait a little longer." She felt that if she listened to his voice right now, she would break. She was terrified that a single apology from him would magically erase the years of psychological torture, and she would crawl right back to her cage. Without listening to the message, she powered the phone off. Outside the window, a late autumn New York rain was pouring down. The strange room was cramped and freezing. But here, she didn't have to tense up at the sound of anyone's footsteps. For the first time, she was determined to make a choice strictly for herself and her child. Whether Julian's remorse was genuine was a problem for later. What Clara needed right now wasn't proof of how much Julian loved her, but the absolute certainty that even without his love, she wouldn't shatter. Clara finally listened to Julian's voicemail 3 days later. During that time, she just sat by the small window of her apartment, staring at the phone. It felt like pressing play would drag her backward in time. She was terrified that hearing his voice would erode her resolve to live independently. He was the man who had inflicted her deepest wounds, yet tragically, he was also the man she had so desperately wanted to love. She finally played it at dawn, having been woken up by morning sickness. She drank a sip of ice water and held the phone to her ear. Clara. The voice that came through the speaker was not the Julian she knew. The sharp, commanding, arrogant tone was gone, replaced by something ragged and broken. He spoke of the notebook. He spoke of the realization that she hadn't been silent, he had just been deaf. When he finally choked out the words, "I'm sorry," Clara squeezed her eyes shut. It was the apology she had fantasized about hearing for years. She had prayed on her hands and knees that her husband would just see her pain. But hearing it now didn't bring her joy. Instead, a wave of profound, agonizing resentment hit her first. Why did it take me literally vanishing for you to notice? Why couldn't you see me crying when we slept in the same bed? Why are you only saying sorry after I've killed every last shred of hope and prepared to raise this child alone? Clara tried not to cry, but the tears flowed anyway. She curled into a ball, holding her stomach, and tried to regulate her breathing for over an hour. Finally, she typed out a brutally brief reply. "I am safe, and the baby is fine. From now on, communicate only through my lawyer." As she hit send, her fingertips shook. It took her over an hour to draft those 2 sentences. Julian didn't reply directly. If this was the old Julian, he would have blown up her phone in a narcissistic rage for being dismissed, or sent private investigators to kick her door down. But that evening, Clara received an email from a high-end family law firm in Manhattan. The attorney Julian had retained formally communicated his intent to negotiate a separation agreement and future child support entirely on Clara's terms. They would never have to meet face-to-face. If Clara wished for no contact, all communication would route through the legal teams. Clara read the email over and over. She couldn't gauge if Julian had experienced a genuine psychological breakthrough or if this was just a highly calculated corporate strategy to trap her later. She had to be hyper-vigilant. An abuser can act remorseful for a few days or play the good guy for a few weeks. True transformation is proven by whether a person can respect boundaries when they are denied what they want. Clara visited a pro bono women's legal clinic in Beacon. In a small fluorescent-lit office, a lawyer named Hannah listened quietly to Clara's account of her marriage, the pregnancy, and the absolute financial control. "Did your husband ever physically assault you?" Hannah asked. Clara shook her head. "No. But he always made me feel like I was committing a crime. I had to submit an itemized defense to buy groceries. I had to report everyone I spoke to. If he got annoyed, I had to apologize immediately, regardless of what happened. If I didn't, I literally couldn't breathe in that house." Hannah didn't dismiss Clara's experience. Bruises aren't the only scars, Clara. Severely restricting a spouse's choices, creating total financial dependency, and maintaining a constant environment of fear that is textbook psychological abuse and coercive control. Hearing a legal professional say those words, Clara went dead silent. She had been gaslighting herself for years, thinking she was just too fragile or sensitive. Both Eleanor and her own mother had told her that as long as her husband wasn't a drunk who hit her, she should count her blessings and endure. She had felt she didn't even have the right to call herself a victim because Julian had never thrown a punch. Hannah explained that Clara didn't need to rush a divorce filing, but she needed to formalize the separation to secure financial rights for prenatal care and the baby's delivery. Leaving that office for the first time, Clara felt her reality was validated without being minimized. Through Hannah, Clara sent 3 non-negotiable conditions to Julian. First, no tracking her down or appearing at her residence. Second, no using their parents to pressure her into reconciling. Third, no using the child as leverage to demand the marriage be reinstated. Julian agreed to all of them instantly. However, he had one counter request. He wanted the right to pay for all her prenatal medical bills and the hospital delivery costs. In return, he signed a legally binding clause stating he would never use those payments to claim custody or force his way into her life. Initially, Clara wanted to refuse. She felt that taking a dime of his money would immediately drag her back into financial dependency, but Hannah gently corrected her. Child support and medical care for a pregnancy he helped create is his legal and moral obligation as the father. It is not a favor, and it is not a leash. Reluctantly, Clara agreed to let him pay the hospital bills directly. She would cover her own rent and living expenses. Julian raised no objections. Meanwhile, after Clara left, Julian's meticulously structured life completely derailed. He went into the corporate headquarters, but couldn't focus on board presentations. His VPs and directors walked on eggshells, terrified of his erratic mood. Normally, Julian would eviscerate someone for a single typo in a deck. But when he started staring blankly through meetings without offering a single correction, the tension in the C-suite actually worsened. Richard Sterling summoned his son to his penthouse executive office. "You need to get a grip on yourself. The firm needs stability." Julian just stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. "I've located Clara." "Good. So, when are you bringing her back to the house?" Julian slowly turned to face his father. "I am not bringing her back anywhere, Dad." Richard's eyebrows shot up. "Then what? She'll come back when she feels like it?" "What if she doesn't?" Richard slammed his palm on his mahogany desk. "She's pregnant. You're going to let a Sterling heir be born in some rundown apartment upstate?" If this were the old Julian, he would have felt a surge of pride at the phrase Sterling heir. Now, it just made his stomach turn. A child wasn't a corporate asset or a piece of leverage. It was Clara's baby. "Yes, it's my child too. But that doesn't give me the right to dictate Clara's life." Richard stared at his son as if he had lost his mind. "What kind of brainwashing did that farm girl do to you to make you act so pathetic?" Julian replied softly. "She didn't do anything. I'm just finally seeing what I've done." "What exactly did you do?" "The rumors about you having a kid with Serena were fake. You didn't beat Clara. You don't have a second family hidden in the Hamptons. What is the grand crime here?" "That's exactly how you think, Dad. That's why you forced this marriage," Julian said, his jaw tightening. Richard's face hardened. Julian spoke with absolute clarity to his father for the first time in his life. "You decided Clara's entire life just to pay off a debt. I punished her every single day as a twisted way of rebelling against you. You just wanted a stable prop for the family image, and Clara was the only one bleeding out to keep that image intact." Richard was speechless. Julian then announced he was voluntarily stepping down from his role in the succession timeline. He was recusing himself from all executive management decisions until the internal audit was complete, and he was handing over all transaction logs related to Serena Thorne to an external federal auditing firm. Richard was apoplectic. "If you step down now, the board of directors will smell blood in the water. Highly classified corporate data was leaked to a rival hedge fund by a woman I brought into the inner circle. That is my responsibility." "Serena conned you. It's not your fault." Julian offered a bitter, self-deprecating smile. "I've lived my whole life thinking exactly like that. If I got angry, it was someone else's fault for provoking me. If I emotionally destroyed Clara, it was your fault for forcing the marriage." He stood up. "I'm done running away from my own collateral damage." Simultaneously with stepping back from the C-suite, Julian began intense psychotherapy. The first time he sat in the plush leather chair of the Upper East Side therapist's office, he didn't even understand why he was there. He always thought people with anger management issues were guys who punched holes in drywall. The therapist asked him what he felt when Clara didn't comply with his exact demands. "I felt disrespected, like when she said she wanted to work at a bakery. She didn't consult me." "Why did she need to consult you?" Julian almost snapped that it was obvious, but he caught himself. "Because we are husband and wife. Consulting a partner is very different from begging for a commanding officer's permission. Which one did you actually want from her, Julian?" He couldn't answer. Through therapy, Julian unraveled a massive, ugly truth. His lack of love wasn't the core issue. The core issue was that he didn't view Clara as a human being. He viewed her as a disruptive object in his perfectly curated life. Whatever she said, he aggressively refused to care. When she wanted to work, he framed it as her insulting the Sterling wealth. When she said she was lonely, he framed it as her being needy and clingy. Because he had predetermined that he resented her, nothing she did could ever be right. Julian didn't tell Clara he was in therapy. He refused to use it as a bargaining chip to prove he was putting in the work. His transformation couldn't be a PR stunt for an audience of one. Meanwhile, Clara lived peacefully in Beacon, right into her second trimester. Once her morning sickness faded, she desperately missed working at the hearth. But commuting from upstate New York to Brooklyn every day was physically impossible. David offered to help her find a short-term sublet near the bakery so she could return. Clara felt extremely guilty accepting the help. David, I feel like you're getting far too involved in my messy life. Sensing her deeply ingrained defense mechanisms, David immediately took a step back. I apologize if I overstepped, Clara. I'm not trying to insert myself. I'll just write down the number of a broker we use for our staff housing. He slid a post-it note across the cafe table. The decision is entirely yours. Those words hit Clara like a freight train. The decision is yours. The realization that someone could offer help without immediately seizing control of her agency felt incredibly foreign. Ultimately, Clara didn't move back to the city. Instead, she rented a cheap, shared commercial kitchen space in Beacon and started her own venture. She received shipments of the artisanal preserves, apples, and herbs from her parents' farm and began baking high-end pastries to sell online. At first, she only got a trickle of orders, but regular customers from the hearth who had loved her baking heard the news and started ordering in bulk. David promoted her new brand on the bakery's massive Instagram account. He didn't frame it as a subsidiary of his shop. He explicitly highlighted that it was an independent, female-owned brand founded by Clara. Clara named her business Second Bloom. It wasn't about a knight in shining armor rescuing her so spring could arrive. It was about surviving a brutal winter entirely on her own and forcing her own flowers to open. Her days finally found a rhythm. But Serena Thorne was not going down quietly. When the federal audit intensified, Serena claimed she was being unfairly targeted because she was pregnant with Julian's child. She leaked stories to her high society circles that she and Julian had been together for years, and that even after his arranged marriage, he begged her not to leave. Simultaneously, she orchestrated a smear campaign, leaking anonymous rumors that Clara was the one who actually stole the corporate data. The logic she fed the rumor mill was that Clara, as the wife, had unrestricted access to Julian's home office and secure laptops. Serena also whispered that Clara's sudden disappearance wasn't because of a marital spat, but because Clara was terrified her corporate espionage was about to be exposed. A few days later, an anonymous post blew up on a massive finance gossip forum. Akin to Reddit or Blind, billionaire heir's wife steals proprietary firm data, elopes with Brooklyn baker. Names weren't explicitly used, but the details were so specific that anyone in the NYC finance and culinary circles knew exactly who it was. The fact that Clara worked at the hearth and David's identity were dragged into the mud. The rumor went viral. The hearth's social media was flooded with toxic comments asking why they harbored corporate thieves and cheaters. Clara's Second Bloom orders were almost entirely canceled within 24 hours. Someone mailed a box of her pastries back absolutely smashed, and one local customer called her screaming that she wouldn't feed her kids food made by a gold-digging whore. After hanging up, Clara stood frozen on the commercial kitchen floor. She knew she hadn't stolen a damn thing, but against an anonymous internet mob, the truth was totally defenseless. If she spoke up, she would be branded as a bitter ex trying to air the Sterling family's dirty laundry. If she stayed silent, it was an admission of guilt. David suggested filing a defamation lawsuit immediately. Clara hesitated. If I step forward, the media circus will only get worse. And it's already hurting your bakery. That is not your burden to carry, Clara. But this whole mess started because of me. David looked her dead in the eye. Making you believe that everything is your fault is exactly what they want. That afternoon, Hannah, Clara's lawyer, called. The Sterling Corporation had formally handed the data breach case over to the FBI for a federal probe, and Clara might be subpoenaed as a witness. Clara couldn't breathe. Her immediate thought was, does Julian suspect me? She assumed that, in the end, to protect his precious corporate empire and his family's PR, Julian was throwing her under the bus as the scapegoat. But Hannah quickly clarified. Clara, The person who submitted the FBI dossier was Julian himself, but he didn't point the finger at you. He officially requested a federal probe into Serena Thorne and his own internal executives. He even submitted evidence that was technically damaging to himself to clear your name. Damaging to himself? He didn't hide the fact that you had access to his home office and the secure laptops. Instead, he handed over the complete IP logs, keystroke data, and home security footage from those dates, proving you never touched them. Clara was stunned. Why would he go that far? Because by doing so, he legally confessed to gross negligence in safeguarding corporate secrets. He's accepting federal culpability for his lack of oversight. A few days later, during her FBI interview in Manhattan, Clara simply stated that she cleaned Julian's office but never opened a single confidential folder. The agents didn't press or intimidate her. The IP logs Julian provided had already irrefutably traced the breaches to proxy servers linked to Serena and her hedge fund accomplices. Walking out of the federal building, Clara saw Julian standing by the curb. He was wearing a stark black suit, standing alongside his high-powered defense attorneys. He looked significantly thinner and more exhausted than she remembered. When Julian saw Clara, he instinctively took a step toward her, but forced himself to stop. He maintained a strict, respectful distance of several yards. "Why didn't you warn me I was going to be subpoenaed?" Clara asked. Julian answered carefully. "I routed the notice through your lawyer. I didn't want to break the no-contact rule." "Did you ever suspect me?" "No." The answer was instantaneous. "Then why did you hand over evidence that put you in the crosshairs? If I tried to cover up the fact that you had access to the house, it would have bred worse conspiracy theories online. And failing to secure those documents at home was entirely my fault." Clara stared at Julian. In the past, if a crisis hit, Julian would ruthlessly blame his subordinates or his family dynamics. Now, while it was hard to entirely trust his motives, he didn't look like a man trying to dodge the bullet. "Are you feeling okay physically?" Julian asked quietly. His eyes flicked to Clara's visibly swelling belly, then immediately snapped back to her face. He didn't step closer, and he didn't reach out to touch her without permission. "I'm fine. The smear campaign online. My legal team is filing injunctions to have it scrubbed, and we are tracking the original IP address of the poster." Clara's face hardened. "Are you trying to make this disappear quietly using the company's fixers?" "No. Everything is going through the federal courts and the FBI. I know the damage isn't reversed just because a post is deleted. David and I have lost a massive amount of business." "I know." "No, you don't." Clara's voice trembled with righteous anger. "You can step right back into another C-suite role whenever you want. People will always bow to you because you have the Sterling name. But the business I built from scratch was decimated in a day. Even when the FBI clears me, people will always whisper that I was a poor country girl who only married into wealth to steal from it." Julian didn't offer a single excuse. "Tell me what I can do to fix it." "Do absolutely nothing." Clara's voice was like steel. If the billionaires understood. "I will not interfere with your business, but I will make sure Serena faces maximum federal sentencing for what she did. I don't consider that a gift to you. I consider it a debt I have to pay to society." Hearing that, Clara didn't say thank you. It was exactly what he was supposed to do. Julian didn't expect a thank you either. They parted ways on the New York pavement without another word. Following that, Julian unsealed the audit results to the Sterling Board of Directors. He didn't hide the fact that he gave Serena extreme security clearance purely based on a personal relationship. The board hit him with a 3-month suspension without pay and clawed back his annual executive bonuses. Richard was furious at his son's transparency. "You could have handled the SEC quietly behind closed doors." "If we buried it, the shadow of suspicion would follow Clara for the rest of her life," Julian replied. "You're destroying the firm's stock price." And because of that exact mentality, Serena was able to exploit our company and everyone in it. Eleanor tried to bypass the lawyers and call Clara directly, but Julian confiscated her phone. "If you call her, You're just going to pressure her to move back into the townhouse. I just want to ask how the baby is doing. Then draft an email and send it to her attorney. Eleanor was deeply offended. You are deliberately isolating your wife from her family. Julian looked at his mother with eyes like glaciers. I'm not the one who isolated Clara from this family, Mom. We all did. Eleanor's face went completely ashen. Online sales for Second Bloom didn't bounce back overnight. However, David and the crew at the Hearth didn't flinch at the rumors. They didn't offer to sell Clara's pastries under a fake name to protect her, nor did they run charity promos. They simply shared their wholesale packaging contacts and logistics networks, so Clara would never have to be dependent on a middleman again. Clara refused to write a sob story in her product descriptions. She didn't want to weaponize her trauma or her disastrous marriage for sympathy sales. Instead, she wrote with stark honesty about the ingredients, the flavor profiles, and the local Hudson Valley farmers who grew the crops. Slowly but surely, the orders returned. A few customers who had bought into the gossip saw the FBI press release regarding Serena's indictment and reordered, adding notes of apology. Other customers worried about Clara overworking herself in her third trimester. Clara responded to the comments with grace. She knew she wasn't entirely healed. Her heart still hammered against her ribs if she saw a missed call from Julian's lawyer, and she still had the knee-jerk instinct to apologize if someone raised their voice in public. But now she recognized that those reactions weren't her inherent flaws. They were trauma responses forged in a house of horrors. Entering her 8th month of pregnancy, while packing a large catering order in Beacon, Clara was hit with agonizing, blinding pain. Initially, she thought it was just from standing too long, but the pain rapidly escalated, and she noticed blood on the kitchen tiles. David immediately called 911. At the local hospital, Clara was diagnosed with severe preterm labor complications. The doctors stated she required absolute bed rest, and depending on the fetal distress, they might have to perform an emergency C-section. Receiving the alert from Hannah, Julian broke every speed limit driving up from Manhattan to Beacon. But when he arrived at the maternity ward, he didn't barge into the room. He sat in a cheap plastic chair at the far end of the hallway, waiting for Clara's explicit permission. Richard and Eleanor demanded to be driven up, but Julian strictly forbade it. Don't come near this hospital unless Clara asks for you, Julian commanded over the phone. Our grandchild could be in danger. How can we sit here? Richard roared. The absolute worst thing for Clara right now is stress. Are you calling us a stressor? Richard raged, but Julian hung up and turned his phone off. After several agonizing hours, a nurse approached Julian with a message from Clara. One support person was allowed in. Julian stood up, his legs shaking, but he didn't push the door open. Did she specifically ask for me? The nurse nodded. When he entered the sterile room, Clara was lying in the bed, deathly pale. Fetal heart monitors were strapped across her stomach. Julian didn't rush the bed. He pulled a chair to the far corner of the room and sat down. Are you okay? Clara stared at the ceiling tiles. The doctor said they need to monitor me for a few days. If you need anything. Julian leaned forward slightly. If I suddenly have to go into surgery, do not let your parents act as my medical proxies without my consent. Julian's face tightened with guilt. I won't. And the baby's name, or where I live after I give birth. Do not let the Sterling family dictate any of it. I will make sure of it. Clara finally looked at him. Not you. I will dictate it, I know. Julian's answer carried zero hesitation. A heavy silence followed. Clara asked softly, Why were you sitting in the hallway earlier? Because I knew there was a high chance you didn't want to look at me. In the past, you would have just kicked the door down. Julian looked at his hands. In the past, if I wanted to enter a room, I just entered. Hearing that, Clara turned her head to look out the hospital window. Julian didn't try to play the hero in that room. He didn't try to hold her hand. He didn't beg, let's start over. He simply poured her water when her cup was empty and stepped out into the hall whenever the nurses needed space. When night fell and Clara finally drifted into a medicated sleep, he quietly slipped out of the room. He stood guard in the freezing hallway chair all night long. 3 days later, Clara's condition stabilized, and she was discharged on bed rest. Julian didn't offer his chauffeured SUV. David and Hannah arrived to pick her up, and Clara returned to her apartment with them. Julian watched the car drive away from a distance. He knew that playing the dutiful husband for 3 days in a hospital wouldn't erase years of abuse. Before, he would have thought one grand gesture bought him a clean slate. Now, he was slowly realizing that true change wasn't a cinematic apology. It was the grueling, invisible repetition of respecting boundaries every single second of every single day. Around that time, the federal indictment against Serena Thorne moved swiftly. The sonogram she had weaponized was indeed a real medical record, but the baby belonged to an executive at the rival hedge fund she was sleeping with. Using him, she had attempted to orchestrate massive insider trading using Julian's credentials. Her plan was to use a fake paternity claim to extort a marriage and millions in sterling stock before the truth came out. The anonymous Reddit post framing Clara was also legally traced back to Serena's burner IPs. She was indicted on federal charges of wire fraud, corporate espionage, and criminal defamation. The financial press had a field day. Julian and Serena's past, Clara's sudden separation, and the fake pregnancy scandal were plastered across the Wall Street Journal and Page 6. Richard Sterling hired elite crisis PR firms to try and bury the articles, but Julian ordered them to stand down. Only correct factual inaccuracies. Do not suppress the story. You want to broadcast your absolute humiliation to the entire world? Richard yelled. The fact that I failed to cut ties with Serena and allowed her into my secure life after I was married is a fact. If I admit to it, my reputation takes the hit. Julian stared down his father. Clara almost lost everything she built because of the reputation I was trying to protect. Julian didn't hold a press conference. He didn't want to use his apologies as a public relations tour. Instead, he handed everything over to the SEC and the FBI and released a brief, brutally honest statement accepting total fault for his negligence. Clara felt completely numb reading the articles. Knowing Serena was facing federal prison offered a brief flash of vindication, but her heart didn't feel lighter. The narrative in the press was that a wicked seductress named Serena had conned poor Julian and ruined Clara's marriage. But Clara refused to accept that narrative. Even if Serena had never existed, Julian still wouldn't have respected her. Serena's fake pregnancy didn't excuse the icy, tyrannical control Julian had subjected Clara to every day of their marriage. Weeks passed, and Clara's due date rapidly approached. During a routine checkup in Beacon, her water broke. Though slightly early, the baby's vitals were strong, and the doctors proceeded with labor. Once the contractions ramped up, Clara had David and Hannah on standby. After a long moment of hesitation, she sent a one-line text to Julian. The baby is coming. Julian arrived at the upstate hospital in less than an hour. Standing outside the delivery ward, he didn't assume entry. He had a nurse ask Clara if he was permitted inside. Clara panted through a contraction, thought for a moment, and nodded. Just tell him to stay by my side, and not say a word. Understood. As the contractions became agonizing, Clara gripped the metal bed rails. Julian desperately wanted to reach out and hold her hand, but he forced his arms to his sides. Only when Clara, blinded by pain, reached out and grabbed his sleeve did he carefully, gently slide his hand into hers. Hours later, the sharp, piercing cry of a baby echoed through the delivery room. A healthy, perfect baby boy was born. When the nurse laid the baby on Clara's chest, she broke down sobbing. Julian's eyes were glassy with tears, but he didn't step forward to claim his son first. He just stood back, watching Clara hold her baby, biting his lip to keep his composure. Do you have a name picked out? Julian asked softly. Clara didn't look away from her son. I'm going to name him Leo. Leo Jenkins. Julian flinched slightly. The child was taking Clara's maiden name, entirely erasing the sterling legacy. Yet, he didn't argue. It's a strong name. Clara studied his face. Why aren't you fighting me on this? You said you'd let me decide, but he is your son. You protected him entirely on your own for 9 months. and you're the one holding him now. Any right I have to be called a father is something I have to earn through my actions from this day forward." Hearing those words, the corners of Clara's eyes burned again. But it wasn't the romantic emotion of love reigniting. It was the profound, exhausted relief of finally, for the first time in her life, not having her agency stolen from her. Before Clara was discharged, Julian signed a comprehensive, ironclad co-parenting agreement. The stipulations were rigid. He would respect Clara's residence, only visit on explicitly scheduled days, and legally bar his parents from exerting any influence over Leo's upbringing or schooling. He permanently surrendered the right to sue for primary custody, and child support was set well above the state maximums, routed automatically into a trust. Eleanor traveled to Beacon to see her grandson and nearly had a stroke when she saw the birth certificate read Leo Jenkins. Regardless of what happened, he is Julian's son. He must carry the sterling name, Eleanor shrieked. Before Clara's face could even harden, Julian stepped directly in front of his mother. "That is Clara's decision, Mom. How can you be okay with this? It's not about whether I'm okay with it. It's the reality." Julian glared at Eleanor, then glanced back at Clara. In the past, Eleanor would have launched into a tirade about family tradition and high society optics. But faced with Julian's absolute wall of defiance, she snapped her mouth shut. That day, for the first time, Clara watched Julian act as a human shield against his own family's toxicity. Yet, that alone wasn't enough to magically open the doors to her heart. A month after Leo was born, Julian met Clara at Hannah's law office to deliver the final updates on the federal case. They sat across from each other in a sterile conference room. Julian explained that Serena had pled guilty and was facing prison time, and the trolls who started the Reddit rumors were being sued into oblivion. "I'm negotiating with the major financial outlets to issue formal retractions to completely clear your bakery's name," Julian said. Clara looked down at the legal briefs and spoke quietly. "Even with Serena in federal prison, it doesn't mean our history is erased. I know your high society friends will say you just made a mistake because of a crazy woman, that she conned you and broke our marriage." Julian said nothing. Clara looked dead into his eyes. "But Serena didn't live in our house. The person who made me submit receipts for aspirin, the person who belittled my baking, the person who treated me like a ghost in my own living room. That wasn't Serena." Julian's face went completely ashen. "I know." Clara held her breath. It was the first time Julian spoke without appending an excuse. "Before, I used to tell myself I was hurting you because my father forced the marriage, and I was just rebelling. But looking back, no matter what my twisted logic was, treating you like garbage was a choice I made every single day." He clasped his hands tightly on the mahogany table. "I fully understand if you never forgive me, and I don't expect us to play house and start over just because Leo is here." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Then why do you keep apologizing?" "Not to earn your forgiveness." Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Just to openly admit that I cannot erase the monster I was to you." A suffocating silence filled the conference room. Clara couldn't deny that Julian was fundamentally changing, but acknowledging a change and willingly offering her heart to be broken again were two entirely different universes. She gathered her coat and bag. "Hannah will send you the schedule for your visitations with Leo." Julian nodded. Before Clara opened the heavy glass door, she paused. "Thank you." Julian looked confused. "For what? For not entirely destroying your chance to be a father?" Clara looked at him for a moment and added, "I didn't do it for you. I did it because one day, Leo might want to know who his dad is." "I know." Julian didn't look wounded by the brutal honesty. Clara walked out of the conference room. The harsh winter sunlight streamed through the Manhattan skyscraper windows. She walked steadily toward the train that would take her back to the home where her son was waiting. Would Julian permanently change? She didn't know. Would his remorse last for decades, or just a few months? She didn't know that either. But Clara was no longer going to gamble her entire existence on those possibilities. She was going to raise Leo, scale her bakery, and live fiercely as Clara Jenkins, not as someone's property, and not as an accessory to the Sterling Empire. Julian could stand outside the door of her life and wait as long as he wanted. But the only person who held the key to that door was Clara herself. The year following Leo's birth was the longest, yet fastest year of Clara's life. The first few months blurred together in a haze of crying, midnight feedings, and bone-deep exhaustion. She would stay awake through the darkest hours of the night, and as soon as she got the baby down, a mountain of flour and wholesale orders for second bloom awaited her. Her body was wrecked, but strangely, she could breathe easier than she ever did in the townhouse. She didn't have to monitor anyone's footsteps. She didn't have to explain why she was eating leftovers at 2 a.m., and no one screamed at her for leaving a hallway light on. If Leo cried, she soothed him. If she felt overwhelmed, she sat on the floor and cried herself. There was no need to hide her humanity from anyone. Clara rented the ground floor of a rustic building in Beacon, turning the front into a commercial prep kitchen and the back into a cozy studio apartment. On one side of the massive kitchen island was her industrial oven and pastry racks. On the other side was Leo's playpen and a box of toys. While the baby napped, she aggressively rolled dough. When he woke up, she strapped him to her chest in a carrier and packed shipping boxes. Orders for Second Bloom grew exponentially. What started as online-only sales expanded when she partnered directly with Hudson Valley Orchards to create seasonal apple butter brioche and maple-glazed tarts. Soon, she was supplying high-end boutique grocers across upstate New York. She didn't use the Sterling scandal for clout. Her sleek, minimalist packaging simply listed the local farms where she sourced her ingredients. Crafted with honey harvested through the harsh Hudson winters, sugar reduced to honor the raw ingredient. Her simple, honest philosophy won over a massive, loyal customer base. David occasionally drove up from Brooklyn to taste test her new products. He maintained a perfectly respectful distance. He adored Leo, but never tried to act like a surrogate father. He also never touched her business logistics without her explicit consent. One afternoon, David looked at the mountain of shipping boxes taking over her kitchen. "You have too much volume to do this alone, Clara." "I know, but I'm terrified of taking on the fixed cost of full-time payroll." "Then don't hire full-time yet. Just find some local freelancers who can prep on your heavy baking days." Clara thought it over, then nodded. "The decision is mine, right?" David smiled warmly. "You don't ever have to ask that question again." Clara smiled back. The fact that someone respected her autonomy was no longer a miraculous anomaly. It had become the standard baseline of her life. With the help of a local women's shelter network, she hired 2 part-time assistants. Anne was a mother re-entering the workforce after a decade, and Rachel was rebuilding her life after a brutal divorce. At first, both women were extremely skittish. Every time they overbaked a batch or mismeasured sugar, they would bow their heads and practically beg not to be fired. Watching them flinch, Clara saw the ghost of her former self. Just because someone makes a mistake doesn't mean their existence is a burden. Clara calmly remeasured the flour and said, "If a batch is ruined, we just throw it out and start over. If you don't know how to do something, just ask me. The only thing I don't want is for you to be so paralyzed by fear that you try to hide a mistake and suffer alone," Anne asked cautiously. "You aren't going to scream at us?" Clara paused, offering a soft smile. "I might get frustrated if we lose product, but being frustrated doesn't give me the right to make you terrified of me." Saying those words out loud, Clara realized how much she had healed. In the past, her only survival skill was figuring out how to dodge Julian's wrath. Now, she understood that even when people are angry, they are strictly responsible for how they express it. Julian only came to see Leo on his legally allotted days, twice a month, every other Saturday, from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. He always parked his SUV across the street exactly 10 minutes early, but he never approached the door. He waited in the car until Clara unlocked the shop and stepped outside. The first few times, Leo screamed in terror because Julian was a stranger. Julian panicked, but he never forced the baby into his arms. He simply sat on the floor of the bakery, rolling a wooden block or reading a board book out loud, waiting for the child to approach him. On the day Leo finally waddled over and grabbed Julian's index finger, the billionaire heir didn't move a muscle for 10 minutes. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, wiping down a counter. "I'm terrified that if I move, he'll let go and never touch me again," Julian whispered. Clara didn't say anything. Julian never tried to perform or play the perfect guy in front of Clara. He didn't bring her lavish bouquets or expensive jewelry. If Leo needed clothes or a new crib, he would ask Clara for a link to the exact item she wanted, then pay for it outside of the court-mandated trust. If Leo spiked a fever, Julian would wire money to her account for the pediatrician, but he would text first to ask if he was allowed to drive up. If Clara said she had it under control, he stayed in Manhattan. It was excruciating for Julian. He had lived his entire life believing that if he felt he was right, he didn't need anyone's permission to act. But now he was learning that even the purest parental concern didn't grant him a VIP pass to bulldoze Clara's boundaries. At the Sterling Corporation, Julian had not returned to his throne. After his suspension ended, the board and Richard expected him to quietly slide back into the CEO track. Instead, Julian requested a lateral demotion to the director of factory safety and logistics. The sight of the billionaire heir walking the floors of their upstate manufacturing plants in steel-toed boots, holding a clipboard and listening to union complaints, shocked the corporate world. Some executives scoffed that it was a PR stunt, assuming he'd be back in the penthouse in a month. Julian offered zero explanations. He knew he had spent his life making sweeping, arrogant decisions without ever listening to the people on the ground. Now, he was listening to why workers were bypassing safety protocols to meet impossible quotas he himself had previously set. During a heated safety meeting, a union rep slammed his fist on the table. "You suits always blame the guys on the floor when a machine takes a finger off. But who the hell slashed our turnaround times and cut our overtime pay?" If this were the old Julian, he would have fired the man on the spot for insubordination. Instead, he didn't interrupt. "Keep going." The rep looked at him suspiciously, then laid out exactly how the corporate mandates were causing fatal errors. After the meeting, Julian investigated the specific quotas that he had personally signed off on a year ago. He drafted a report, placing the entirety of the blame squarely on executive leadership, meaning himself. Richard called him, screaming, asking why he was writing a legally binding document that opened the firm to union lawsuits. Julian didn't alter a single word. "I gave the order that caused the hazard, Dad. I was the executive in charge. The liability is mine." Julian also religiously attended his therapy sessions. One afternoon, his therapist asked if he secretly harbored the hope that Clara would fall back in love with him. Julian was quiet for a long time. "I do. And if she never does?" Julian let out a long, ragged exhale. "Before, I would have convinced myself that since I put in all this hard work to change, I was owed a second chance. Now, I know that giving a second chance is entirely Clara's right. Me choosing not to be an abusive monster is just the bare minimum I should be doing anyway, regardless of what she decides. How long will it take for you to fully accept that in your gut?" Julian offered a bitter smile. "I probably haven't fully accepted it yet. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I feel incredibly bitter. I think I've torn my ego apart. I've lost my company's standing. Why won't she just look at me once? And how do you manage that entitlement? I don't text her. If I demand a reward for acting like a decent human being, then everything I've done is just another form of manipulation. I'm just right back where I started." Julian fought daily to ensure his remorse didn't become a weapon. The fact that he suffered when Clara left. The fact that he stopped drinking. The fact that he was in therapy. None of these were heroic sacrifices Clara needed to applaud. They were just the necessary steps to clean up the catastrophic wreckage he had caused. As Leo's first birthday approached, both sides of the family started voicing their opinions. Clara planned a small, intimate gathering with a smash cake in the backyard of her bakery. But Richard Sterling called, stating he had already booked a ballroom at the Plaza Hotel in New York. His reasoning was that, as the first Sterling grandson, The entire corporate board and high society needed to be hosted. Julian told his father in no uncertain terms to cancel the plaza and respect Clara's plans. Richard was livid. She already stole his last name. Now she's going to throw a backyard BBQ for a billionaire's heir? He's not an heir, Dad. He's Clara's son. How long are you going to walk around wearing a hair shirt, Julian? I'm not wearing a hair shirt. I'm just stopping you from steamrolling people. Believing Clara was manipulating his son, Richard ordered Eleanor to go upstate and bully Clara into compliance. Eleanor agonized over the trip. She, too, had undergone a harsh reality check over the past year. Initially, she thought Clara was just being hysterical and stubborn. Julian had apologized, the mistress was in prison, and the baby was born. Why wouldn't she just come home? But one day, while packing up the Upper East Side townhouse to sell it, Eleanor found Clara's catering notes in a kitchen drawer. It was a meticulously detailed spreadsheet of every single Sterling relative, their allergies, their favorite wines, exactly where they liked to sit at Thanksgiving. It was massive logistical labor that no one had ever asked her to do, but she had managed flawlessly. And instead of thanking her, Eleanor had treated her like a slightly slow maid who was lucky to be there. Eleanor remembered telling Clara she loved her like a daughter, right before telling her to keep her husband from straying. Her love had always been entirely conditional on Clara being a compliant, suffering martyr. A week before the birthday, Eleanor showed up unannounced at Second Bloom in Beacon. Feeling incredibly awkward, she stood outside the glass door for 10 minutes before finally knocking. When Clara opened the door, Eleanor didn't push her way in. "I'm sorry for showing up without calling." Clara looked at her former mother-in-law, her guard immediately going up. "What can I do for you, Eleanor? Can we talk for a few minutes?" Clara hesitated, then led her to a small wrought iron table in the backyard. Eleanor desperately wanted to peek inside to see Leo, but she kept her eyes on the table. "I didn't come here about the birthday party," Eleanor began. Clara waited in silence. Eleanor clutched her designer purse tightly. "I used to tell myself I was a wonderful mother-in-law to you. I bought you Birkin bags. I defended you against Aunt Margaret's snide comments. I thought I was doing everything right." She laced her manicured fingers together, trembling slightly. "But every time you looked like you were drowning, every time you implied Julian was hurting you, I just told you to endure it. Rather than admitting my son was severely flawed, I forced you to carry the weight of the entire marriage." Clara didn't say a word. If I admitted Julian was in the wrong, it meant I failed as a mother. I couldn't handle that. So I convinced myself that if you just tried a little harder, it would all magically fix itself. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I am so deeply sorry, Clara." Hearing that apology, a massive knot in Clara's chest loosened slightly. Years ago, she had prayed for the day her mother-in-law would acknowledge her pain. But hearing it now didn't reverse time. "I never thought you actively hated me, Eleanor," Clara said quietly. "And honestly, that made it so much worse. Because you said you loved me, but you constantly demanded that I sacrifice my sanity to protect Julian's image." Eleanor looked down. "I was so desperate to be a good daughter-in-law. I didn't want the family whispering that the poor farm girl didn't know her place. So I never said no. You don't ever have to do that again. I know." Clara's voice was firm and cold, but Eleanor didn't look offended. "I won't." Eleanor pulled a small envelope from her purse. "This isn't a gift for Leo. You can throw it away if you want." Inside the envelope wasn't a check or a trust fund document. It was a faded, crinkled photograph. It was a picture of a 6-year-old Clara and a 12-year-old Julian playing by the creek in the Hudson Valley. Julian had mud on his expensive slacks, and Clara was laughing vibrantly, holding the edge of his jacket. Clara stared at the photo for a long time. "Why are you giving this to me?" "I found it in a storage box at the estate. I was going to throw it out, but it felt like it belonged to you." Eleanor stood up. "I will only attend the birthday party as a quiet guest. If you don't want me there at all, I won't come." Clara thought for a moment before speaking. "You can come, but absolutely no talk about corporate succession or the Sterling legacy in front of Leo." Eleanor nodded fiercely. I promise. Leo's first birthday party was held exactly as Clara planned, in the backyard of the bakery. Clara had baked a beautiful, rustic smash cake decorated with local berries. Anne and Rachel helped set up low picnic tables and string lights across the yard. Clara's parents had driven down, bringing a hand-knit sweater for their grandson. David and the crew from the hearth were also there, drinking cider and laughing. Julian arrived an hour early. He was dressed casually in a sweater and jeans, but immediately started hauling tables and running extension cords for the lights. He offered help, but only operated strictly within the boundaries Clara set. Leo, wearing tiny suspenders, was crawling at lightning speed across the grass. When Julian extended his hands, the boy stared at him for a second, then grabbed Julian's knees and pulled himself up to stand. A blinding, genuine smile broke across Julian's face. Clara watched the scene from the porch. Years ago, if she had seen that smile, her only thought would be, I want him to look at me like that. Now, she just genuinely hoped Julian could be a good father to Leo. That didn't require them to be husband and wife. Shortly after the party started, Richard Sterling arrived. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 senior board members and a handful of elite corporate associates. Eleanor frantically whispered to her husband, asking what the hell he was doing, but Richard brushed her off. It's the first Sterling grandson's birthday. It's expected. Clara's face turned to stone. Julian immediately intercepted his father. Dad, the agreement was close family only. These men practically are family, Richard scoffed. Clara did not authorize this. Richard waved his hand dismissively. What's the big deal? It's a backyard. We'll just stand. Clara debated whether she should kick them all out. She didn't want a screaming match in front of her parents and friends who had driven all the way here. Reluctantly, she had Anne bring out extra chairs, but her blood was boiling. Right before it was time to cut the cake, Richard suddenly stood up and tapped his cider glass. Today, we celebrate the first birthday of the Sterling family's inaugural grandson. Clara felt a sickening sense of dread. Richard smiled, looking down at Leo. Even though his paperwork currently bears his mother's name, blood is blood. One day, this boy will take his rightful place at the head of our empire. That's enough, Richard. Clara's voice sliced through the backyard like a whip. Everyone froze. Richard's face hardened. Excuse me? Clara stepped forward. Today is a 1-year-old's birthday party, not an investor relations summit. You do not get to dictate this child's future. I am speaking of his legacy. I am his grandfather. Being his grandfather does not give you ownership of his life. An agonizing, suffocating silence fell over the affluent guests and the bakery staff. Arthur Jenkins reached out to grab his daughter's arm to calm her, but Martha firmly held her husband's hand back, letting Clara speak. Clara's eyes burned with years of repressed fury. I accepted a marriage because I was bought and paid for. I sacrificed my youth, my agency, and my soul to repay your generosity and honor a deal between families. But I will never let you place that same collar around Leo's neck. Richard's face turned a mottled, furious red. Do you have any idea how much capital our family pumped into your father's chest? The townhouse you lived in? The dad. Julian's voice was a lethal, booming command. He stepped directly between Richard and Clara, scooping Leo up into his arms. Shut your mouth! Richard stared at his son in utter shock. You're taking her side in public? I'm not taking a side. I'm stopping a delusion. Leo is my son. Julian stared down the board members and his father. So I will clarify this right now. Leo is not the heir to the Sterling Corporation. It is entirely undetermined if I will even take over the company. The future of this boy is none of your goddamn business. Richard let out a derisive scoff. You're going to hand a multi-billion-dollar firm over to outsiders? A corporation must be led by the bloodline. Competence leads a corporation, Dad. DNA is not a resume. And frankly, considering the utter havoc I wreaked on the people I supposedly loved because I thought my bloodline made me a god, I'm the last person who should be lecturing anyone about legacy. Julian didn't back down an inch. Because I was your son, I thought owning people was my birthright. Because of that exact arrogance, I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me. Clara stared at Julian's back, speechless. Julian locked eyes with his father. I will not pass that curse on to Leo. Whether this kid grows up to be a baker, a farmer, or an artist, I will defend his right to choose with my dying breath. Now, if you can't respect that, get off Clara's property. Humiliated in front of his executives, Richard stormed out of the backyard. The board members and associates awkwardly mumbled their apologies and practically sprinted to their luxury cars. The atmosphere in the yard was heavy and tense. But then, Arthur Jenkins clapped his hands together loudly. All right, let's get back to the party. The boy only turns one once. Slowly, people sat back down. To lighten the mood, they set up a fun modern tradition on a blanket, placing various objects in front of the baby to see what he would crawl toward and predict his future. There was a stethoscope, a dollar bill, a wooden gavel, and a small whisk. Leo stared at the objects for a solid minute. Then, entirely ignoring them, he lunged forward and grabbed a massive fistful of Clara's berry smash cake, shoving it into his mouth. The yard erupted in laughter. David chuckled. Looks like he's taking over the bakery after all. Clara smiled radiantly, gently wiping the frosting off her son's nose. No, he just chose what he wanted to eat. Julian, standing nearby, nodded softly. That's the most honest choice there is. When the sun set and the guests trickled out, Eleanor quietly offered to help with the dishes. When Clara politely declined, saying the staff would handle it, Eleanor didn't force the issue and hugged her grandson goodbye. Julian stayed until the very end, folding up the rented chairs and hauling trash bags. When the yard was completely dark and quiet, he walked to his SUV and pulled a small cardboard box from the trunk. He walked up to the porch where Clara was standing. This isn't a gift for Leo. Clara looked at the box warily. Then what is it? Something that belongs to you. Inside the box was the black moleskine notebook. Clara's face immediately hardened. The notebook contained the horrifying rules she had forced herself to obey, the pages soaked in her tears. It was a physical manifestation of a past she never wanted to revisit, but also a piece of her soul she couldn't just burn. Why are you returning this now? She asked, defensively. I don't think it's something I have any right to keep, Julian replied softly. Clara pulled the notebook out. It felt distinctly thicker than before. What did you write in here? Just the last few pages. Clara flipped past her own tear-stained entries to the back of the book. She recognized Julian's sharp architectural handwriting. Expecting a partner to wait up until 2 a.m. is not a marriage. It is demanding a hostage. Controlling a spouse's finances under the guise of budgeting is financial abuse. Demanding blind trust while offering zero transparency is not a relationship. It is a dictatorship. Clara running away was not a malicious act to punish me. It was a desperate act of survival to protect herself. My profound remorse does not mean Clara is obligated to forgive me. Every single sentence was dated. It seemed he had written one agonizing realization at a time after every therapy session over the past year. On the very last page, there was a single, definitive sentence. Becoming a safe person is infinitely more important than saying, I love you. Clara stared at the pages, unable to close the book for a long time. Julian spoke quietly. I'm not showing you this to demand a reward. Do you really think I'd be swooning because you finally figured out basic human decency? Clara asked sharply. Julian offered a sad, honest smile. If I said a small, pathetic part of me didn't hope you'd see I've changed, I'd be lying. But I swear to you, I am not asking you to take me back because of this book. Clara placed the notebook back into the box. I know you've changed. Julian's eyes widened slightly. But, Clara's voice wavered. Even knowing you've changed, I don't know if I can ever love you again. Julian slowly nodded, swallowing hard. I know. When I look at you, I still see the terror in your eyes from that night I threw your cake away. From the night I brought Serena into your sanctuary and asked why you felt the need to sit next to your own husband. A flash of raw agony crossed Julian's face, but he didn't try to defend himself or excuse the memories. I don't think those memories will ever vanish, even if I forgive you, Clara whispered. They shouldn't vanish, Julian said firmly. And you shouldn't have to erase your trauma just to make me feel better about myself. Clara looked at Julian under the dim yellow porch light. He looked entirely different from the flawless, terrifyingly cold groom from their wedding day. But Clara no longer judged a man by a single moment of vulnerability or poetic words. Julian took a step back toward the driveway. As long as I follow all your rules, can I just stay on the perimeter of your life as Leo's dad? Clara didn't answer immediately. Julian didn't press her. From inside the bakery, Anne poked her head out the back door. Clara, should we scrub the inside of the industrial ovens tonight or leave it for the morning? Clara looked back inside. The massive pile of dough she needed to prep for tomorrow's morning deliveries was still sitting on the stainless steel island. The schedule was shot because of the party. She could do it alone, but it would take her until 3 a.m. She turned back to Julian, pointing at a spare canvas apron hanging on a hook by the door. Wash your hands first. Julian stared at her, stunned. I can come inside? To work. Yes. Julian practically scrambled up the porch steps. I can do that. He took his boots off and walked into the commercial kitchen. Clara showed him how to properly weigh and portion the brioche dough. Julian was incredibly clumsy at first. His first few dough balls were lopsided and sticky. When Clara told him to scrap them and start over, he didn't argue or get defensive. He just scraped the table and tried again. Is this the right weight? He asked. Add a little more flour. How much? Exactly as much as I tell you to. Don't improvise. Julian let out a soft, genuine laugh. I can do that. I've had a lot of practice recently in not doing whatever the hell I want. Clara looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the absolute tiniest ghost of a smile touched her lips. That smile was not total forgiveness. It was not a promise to remarry him, and it certainly wasn't a declaration of resurrected love. It was simply the very first moment they had ever shared a space as equals, working together without anyone's boundaries being violated. As the night deepened, rows of perfectly portioned pastries filled the cooling racks. Julian broke down the cardboard shipping boxes, and Clara printed the shipping labels. In the back room, Leo was sleeping soundly in his crib. When the kitchen was finally spotless, Julian took off the apron and hung it up. I'll head back to the city now. Clara nodded from the doorway. As he put his coat on and stepped out into the crisp night air, he turned back. He looked like he desperately wanted to say something else, but ultimately, he demanded nothing. Next Saturday is my day. I'll be here at 1 p.m. I won't be late. As Julian turned to walk to his car, Clara called out, Julian. He stopped and looked back. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. Thank you for defending me against your father today. Julian's eyes wavered. You don't need to thank me for that. It was my job, but I still have the right to say thank you, don't I? She offered a slow, careful smile. Yeah. Julian breathed out. Thank you. For what? For saying thank you. Clara didn't close the door immediately. She watched Julian walk across the gravel parking lot to his SUV. Unlike the Julian of the past, he didn't look over his shoulder, expecting her to run after him or change her mind. Only when his taillights completely disappeared down the dark highway did Clara step back inside and lock the door. Returning to her small bedroom, she opened the cardboard box and pulled out the black notebook. The draconian rules she had written in terror and the sentences of accountability Julian had written in remorse now lived side by side in the same binding. She picked up a pen and turned to the very last blank page. After years of being too paralyzed to write anything true, she wrote a single sentence. To love someone, I must not lose myself. Beneath it, she added one final line. Whether I ever open this door again, is a choice that belongs entirely to me." Clara closed the notebook. She wasn't promising that Julian would eventually become her husband again. She wasn't claiming she had magically healed from her trauma. Would they ever live in the same house again under the same name? No one knew. But rushing to an absolute ending wasn't the point anymore. Julian needed the years it would take to prove he could endure the wait, and Clara needed the time to ensure she would never doubt her own intuition again. Leo needed a safe, honest love, not the guilt of his parents or the toxic expectations of a corporate dynasty. Clara walked over to the crib and gently pulled the blanket over her sleeping son. Leo's tiny hands were curled into fists, his breathing soft and rhythmic. She kissed his forehead, then walked over and cracked the window open. The freezing, crisp midnight air of the Hudson Valley swept into the room, mingling with the warm, sweet scent of the brioche dough resting on the counters. In the far distance, she could hear the faint hum of Julian's SUV getting on the interstate. She didn't try to stop the sound from fading. She didn't have to chase after the person leaving, and she didn't have to blindly accept the person trying to return. Love wasn't about surrendering your soul out of the terrifying fear of losing someone. It was about ruthlessly guarding your own boundaries, taking absolute accountability when you fail, and having the endurance to wait in the cold until the other person is ready to unlock the door. That door could never be forced open from the outside. It could only be opened from the inside, by a person who finally felt entirely safe. And right now, the key to that door rested firmly and solely in the hands of Clara Jenkins.